In our time, when on the one hand some circles inflating various kinds of apocalyptic scenarios based on the speculative theory of clash of civilizations are looking for images of enemies of Eastern origin, and in parallel with this, xenophobic sentiments are reviving against persons of Eastern origin. And with, on the other hand, some of the people of Eastern origin have an inferiority complex and blind copying of Western mass culture. I think it will be appropriate to touch on the topic of Orientalism. In general, the topic of Orientalism is interesting because it covers almost all spheres of our life: social and historical consciousness, stereotypes, folklore, mass media and mass culture, and of course, social and human science and education. I will immediately note that Orientalism does not mean the science of Oriental studies at all, but the style of ideologized thinking, which takes as a basis the previously accepted otherness, the exotism of the so-called East. It should be recognized that at present in the post-Soviet space, both among specialists and among ordinary people, Orientalism is perceived simply as the science of the East, and the term Oriental studies is used as a synonym for Orientalism, and Orientalist is a specialist along the East. Many prominent representatives of post-colonial studies such as Edward Said, Anwar Abdelmalik, Tibuavi, Ziauddin Sardar considered Orientalism as a certain way of thinking, worldview, a system of views that served and to a certain extent continues to serve the implementation of imperial and neo-imperial projects. The popularization of the term Orientalism in the sense of a universal model of distortion of the East is associated by many with the name of Edward Said, a world-famous American scientist, public figure, a Jerusalem Christian by origin. Said's writings, especially his classic Orientalism, first published in 1978, offer an interesting methodology, moreover a paradigm through which one can understand how any non-Western culture is perceived and distorted in the West, including culture and nomads, and in general all Asians. The leitmotif of Edward Said's work Orientalism is the thesis asserting that the concept of East was deliberately invented in Europe for the purpose of self-identification. To put it another way, medieval Europe needed a kind of alien. As a rule, a stranger is never good. He is either a bloodthirsty Saracen, Moor, or an invader of the Janissary Turkish, or a Tatar sweeping away everything in his path. Also, all these strangers were higher both spiritually and materially than medieval Europe. The Europeans identified these same strangers with all the negative qualities that they could think of. It could not be superfluous to recall such an interesting fact that European scientists, for example Bacon, considered Averroes and Avicenna, Muslim scientists who had a tremendous impact on the development of science in the West, to be hidden Christians of the East, such an extent the East was alienated. Said argued that the Orientalist worldview sets the following axiom: an Oriental person lives in the East. He leads an ideal Eastern life in the state of Eastern despotism and lust, weighed down by a sense of Eastern fatalism. The Turkish socialist Ergene, in his monograph devoted to the problem of the methodology of studying Muslim communities in modern science, notes that most of the works of medieval European travelers about the Islamic world were the result of violent fantasy and outright lies. In these works, Muslims appear as libertines, pagans, barbarians, deceivers. Even the political strong power of Muslim rulers and dynasties was associated with their sexual power. Said, on the cover of Orientalism, deliberately placed the image of Oriental people, which has become a classic, captured by the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme. Many people in the West really imagined Arabs, Turks, Persians, in one word Eastern people, exactly as Gérôme depicted them in the picture, naked, erotic, and perversely attractive. In a word, In the classical Orientalist worldview, the East, on the one hand, was presented as outlandish, breathtaking, but on the other hand, as wild, depraved, sexual, inhibitant, and fanatical. And this way of thinking, also to a greater extent remained in the past, nevertheless continues to have today somewhere a direct and somewhere indirect influence on the societies of the West and those societies that are open to the influence of Western culture and Western mass media. We should not forget that the scientific thought and public consciousness of Russia, which has a central old imperial past, is also to a certain extent subject to Orientalist patterns. In particular, the roots of modern xenophobia, racism against people of the Eastern type, and simply their alienation in society can be found in the Orientalist worldview. Said showed in his work that knowledge is not just an abstract collection of texts and ideas, but is a public institution closely related to the interests and worldview of the ruling class. In other words, it's a continuation of politics. Therefore, it's necessary to approach Orientalism not as a pure science, but to consider it in the context of the development of the Western societies that created it, as a continuation of their politics, as a discourse of power. At present, we see the results of this process of alienation of the East both in the field of historiography, theology, sociology, political science and literature, art, anthropology. In addition, we quite often encounter this process of alienation in everyday life thanks to the mass media, which one-sidedly covers the events and processes taking place in the world. This is one of the key reasons for the bias towards the East, observed both in the scientific world and at the level of the layman, and not only in the West, since as at present the bulk of humanity is influenced by Orientalist patterns and clichés and Orientalist way of thinking. Critical analysis of Orientalism is of great importance for the implementation of an objective analysis of history and international relations. Understanding the political and ideological background of Orientalism is necessary to find a way out of the impasse in which modern science has entered, especially the social science and the humanities. It's also necessary for our country to achieve ideological spiritual independence, a better understanding of our history, religion and customs, the contribution of the Eurasian Turkic Muslim nomadic civilization to the development of human culture and civilization, and of course, to strengthen the position of the Kazakh language, primarily among us, Kazakhs. And of course, it's inappropriate to oppose the process of knowledge exchange between representatives of different religions and cultures. For example, it's inappropriate to oppose the study of the East by the researchers from the West. But the main condition should be objectivity, impartiality, non-susceptibility to any kind of stereotypes.